Hey, Newbie Dan here. I want to talk to you about knobs. First though, sorry about the air conditioner. When I start talking about knobs, I get all hot under the collar. Wait, just a minute, what? What? No, knobs. For shop jigs. Get your mind out of the gutter. This is a family show. Sorry about that. Right, yes, knobs for shop jigs. Anyway, there's a bunch of different kinds of knobs and a bunch of different kinds of ways of making them. I'm going to show you some of my favorites. So if you want to see my knobs, stick around. Let me just say a brief word about knob gender. Yeah, you heard that right. This is a male knob. This is a female knob. If you don't know why they're called that, ask your parents. In case it's not obvious, a male knob has a bolt attached to it. When you turn the knob, the bolt turns. A female knob does not have a bolt attached. The knob spins, but in general, the bolt is stationary. I won't be talking about male knobs in this video because it's easy to convert a female knob into a male knob. Just put a nut on a bolt and tighten down the knob against the nut. Sometimes you need two nuts. And there you go, a male knob. Yes, that's right. You can turn a female knob into a male knob by adding a couple of nuts. And a bolt. Here's a quick overview, then I'll go into the details. I make knobs by starting with a blank of the desired size. The blank is either round, or square, or rectangular. I drill a hole in the blank, then use an insert nut like this, or a coupling nut like this. Finally, I shape the knob if needed and sand it. And if the mood strikes, I might even put a finish on it. You can make knobs out of pretty much any scrap wood that's lying around. Most of the time, I like to use 3/4 inch stock, but it turns out that 1/2 inch stock can work pretty well also. Softwood like pine is easiest to shape, but most of the time I use Baltic birch plywood or hardwood like maple or red oak. For most of this video, I'll stick with pine, just for simplicity's sake. If I want the knob to end up flush against the stock, I use a Type D insert nut like this. Type D insert nuts have a flange on the top and a hole for a hex key. I usually use insert nuts that are for 1/4 inch bolts with 20 threads per inch, and they're 20 millimeters long. For pine, I drill a 5/16 inch hole. For harder wood, I'll drill an 11/32 inch hole. I place the knob on a flat surface and start threading the nut into the hole using a 6 millimeter hex key. Make sure you press down as you turn it and try to keep it relatively straight. When it gets in far enough, you can pick it up and finish it off. I like to thread it down tight enough that the flange is flush with the surface of the knob, which is easy with pine. If you need it flush with harder wood, you can use a Forstner bit to drill a shallow counterbore. Depending on the actual thickness of the wood, the insert nut may stick out a little on the other side. If that matters to you, you can sand it down pretty easily. If you ever have problems with the insert nut coming loose, you can use some epoxy glue. Just don't get it on the inside threads. If you don't want a flange on the top, use Type E insert nuts, but then you'll have to use some epoxy glue. If I want to leave a little room for my fingers between the knob and the surface, I use a coupling nut like this. These nuts are for 1/4 inch bolts with 20 threads per inch, and they're 1 inch long. I had trouble finding coupling nuts the right size and length locally, so I bought a pack of 50 from Amazon. I may never use them all, but my philosophy is that you can't have too many bolts, nuts, screws, or washers. If I'm using softwood like pine, I drill a 3/8 inch hole. If your wood is harder, you'll probably need a bigger hole. You can try using a vise to press the nut into the hole, but I prefer to use my drill press. I don't turn it on, of course. I have this 1/4 inch bolt with the head cut off and two nuts tightened against each other. I screw the coupling nut on one end and put the other end in the drill press with the nuts right next to the chuck. Then I lower the spindle to press the coupling nut into the hole. Depending on the thickness of the wood, I might not press it all the way down. But if I end up pressing it in too far, I just use a 3/8 inch dowel to tap it back out a little. Or a lot. Make sure you always use a washer when you use a knob with a coupling nut. A circular knob like this is simple to make. Just cut a hole using a hole saw, remove the circle, sand it smooth, then enlarge the hole and add the hardware. A circular knob is fine as long as the knob doesn't need to get too tight. Once it's tightened down a lot, your hand just slips on the knob. You can solve this by sanding or trimming the knob to make some sides, like this. Or better yet, try this next shape. An octagonal knob has 8 sides, and it's much easier to get a good grip on than a circular knob. Cut a square block, drill the hole, and add the hardware. We want to get rid of the 4 corners to turn the square into an octagon. You could use a sander to get rid of the corners, like this, or a bandsaw, or whatever. Or you could make a simple jig and use your table saw. This is just a piece of scrap wood. These holes were already there. They're not part of the jig. I have an insert nut here, which is counterbored so it doesn't drag on my tabletop. I'm going to clamp the square to the jig, but I have to remove the insert nut first. I'm drawing 2 lines from corner to corner to help with alignment. Then I use a wing screw to hold it down. The shape of the wing screw here actually helps to keep the square centered. I position it so I'll be cutting off a corner. Then I raise the blade and position the fence. I cut off 1 corner. Then I turn the square 90 degrees using the lines I drew earlier to help me eyeball the alignment and cut the next corner. And repeat for the other 2 corners. Then I put the insert nut back in, sand it a little, and there you go. 1 hexagonal knob. This is a star knob. You can get a really good grip with these knobs, but they're more work to make. Again, start with a square. I'm going to show you 2 different knobs using 2 different techniques. Drill the holes first because it's easier and helps with perspective. It's up to you whether to add the hardware now or later. I'm going to make round indentations in the 4 sides. There's lots of ways to do this. For this larger knob, I'll use the end of my belt sander. Not only is this fairly easy, at least with pine, I get to make snow. We interrupt this fascinating video with some breaking news. It turns out this sanding technique is not without peril. Let's see that again in slow motion. So let this be a warning to all of you out there. These machines can take a bite out of you when you least expect it. This news segment was brought to you by Neosporin, #1 mom recommended for shop owies everywhere. Now back to our feature presentation. After making the indentations, I round over all the rough edges. For this smaller knob, I'm using a sanding drum on my drill press. I press each side into the sanding drum, making an indentation of the size I want. It's not perfectly symmetrical, but it's pretty good. Once the indentations are done, I shape the points so they're more rounded. And finally, I round over all the edges. I think this sanding drum is actually too coarse for doing this with pine, but I'm going more for functionality than perfection. At least, that's what I'm telling myself. When I'm done, I insert the coupling nut. I actually made 2 of these knobs. Here they are on my drill press table. I think they look pretty good. This is a T-knob that I bought. They're about the same amount of work as the star knobs. Instead of starting with a square, you start with a rectangle. This one is 2 inches long and 3/4 of an inch wide. It's best to install the hardware first so you know exactly where to stop shaping. Like the 4-star knob, you make 4 indentations, but this time it's 2 per side. Then round everything over. These are nice, but I prefer the 4-star knob. The last thing I'm going to show you is how I made another knob like this using 1/2-inch red oak. I started with a 1.5-inch square. After shaping and sanding the knob, I cleaned up a little with a rotary tool and brush attachment and some hand sanding. Red oak has a lot of texture and color changes, so there's no need to try and make it perfectly smooth. Then I applied 2 coats of Rust-Oleum spray lacquer. I totally don't know what I'm doing here, and I applied way too much. But fortunately, it ended up not making a difference. I waited 10 minutes between coats. Here it is after the second coat had dried for 10 or 15 minutes. Looks pretty good, especially for someone who doesn't know what they're doing. I'll let it dry overnight before using the knob. So which knob shape should you use? And what size should they be? Well, that's totally up to you. For larger clamping knobs, I almost always use an octagonal knob with an insert nut. If I need to clamp something down really, really tight, I'll use a star knob shape. For smaller knobs, like attaching something to a T-track, I use a star knob with the coupling nut. As I said at the start, I'm sure there's plenty of other shapes, hardware, and techniques. These are just the ones I use most often. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If so, please give it a thumbs up and consider leaving a comment. Thanks! Check out the description for links to products seen in this video. Just scroll down, click Show More, and scroll down until you see the links. And if you like what I do here, click that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring that bell to get notified about new videos. Thanks!